Good morning. I'm Craig Adkins. I work with the nursery and greenhouse growers throughout the foothills. And Ronald had asked me to come this morning and talk on natives for profit. And I got to thinking there are a number of different angles that I could approach this from. What I'm going to try to do is probably give you some of my thoughts on my observations over the past 20 years and where I think there may be some opportunities for someone who would want to maybe go out and collect seed, start a small seedling nursery, mainly focusing on what we call native ornamentals. Of course, that native ornamental term can sometimes be a misnomer because for years what we've done in the industry, we've had a lot of native ornamentals, we've selected a lot of cultivars, but maybe what we're looking at is some of these things that haven't really been in production yet that we would like to see made more available on a regional level for some of our larger field growers. I throw this up, and even though it's predated 2004, this was a good picture of some of the horticultural crops in North Carolina. And if you look, about 75% of the total was actually related to greenhouse and nursery crops and Christmas trees. This past year, 2008, the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services started lumping Christmas trees in with greenhouse and nursery crops. And basically, if you look at that, that's 3/4 of the horticulture crops that are produced in North Carolina. And what's interesting is if we look at the 2008 values, basically we're looking at $890 million. Of course, with the economy like it is, the values have gone down. And I like to say that 10% of that, or about 89 million, was produced probably right in Wilkes County, Caldwell, Burke, McDowell, Catawba, and Caldwell counties. And that included Alexander, if I've missed them out. But the reason I'm pointing this out is if you look at nursery crop production, most of you all are probably familiar with field production, container production. 30 years ago, probably 80% of the nursery production in North Carolina was field production. Today, 80% is probably container production. However, if you look at western North Carolina, what you're going to see is a lot of it's still predominantly field production. And over the last 10 to 15 years, we've sort of seen the emergence of pot and pot production and an emergence of more propagation or seedling type nurseries. Now, the common denominator that all of these types of production have in common is they all have to have starter plants. And the question is, well, where are those starter plants coming from? Well, hopefully later in the morning we're going to address that. But we do have propagation nurseries in North Carolina. They grow a variety of different types of ornamentals. There's probably over 3,000 different species/cultivars of woody ornamentals alone, and not even touching herbaceous perennials that are produced in nurseries in North Carolina. I think for the sake of today, though, we're going to focus on seed collection and native type of plants to the southern Appalachian Mountains. If we look, you know, one of the things in the industry, and these plants have been out there for 30 to 40 years, we've selected a lot of our native ornamentals already for their aesthetic or ornamental features. Probably the number one thing is blooms. And, you know, we look at things like our buckeyes, our mountain laurel, franklinia, redbuds. I mean, if you look at the number of cultivars of redbuds that are out there, it's just astronomical. You know, we have white flowering cercis now. I don't want to say white redbuds, but that's sort of redundant. But we've selected them for their growth characteristics, for purple leaves, for golden leaves, for variegated leaves, and maybe compactness, weeping characteristics. And I use that just as an example. But you know, you look at the pictures up here this morning, and you can see that a lot of these things are maybe plants that you currently have in your landscape, and a lot of the field nurseries, container nurseries are already growing them. But I think there's still opportunities out there for people that want to look at producing seedlings for some of these field-grown nurseries or container nurseries in the process of production that we look at in the nursery crop industry. This doesn't show real good, but this is an example of forest pansy and one of the lighter colored Cercis leaves. We select them for basically their growth characteristics, maybe their bark characteristics, the berries, all of these. You know, we have so many nice native ornamentals that we could look at, and the great thing about these is the majority of them can be propagated from seed. We often think about the flowers or some other type of ornamental feature, but we could also select them for their winter or fall and winter interests, like the black gum, the sourwood, and the red twig dogwood. Of course, I get to thinking, you know, we have the native gray twig dogwood, we have the yellow twig dogwood. I mean, you could just about have a dogwood propagation nursery. Of course, we learned from 30 years ago, you can't build your whole nursery on just growing dogwoods and azaleas, because what can happen is there's a tremendous diversity of plants out there. If we look at the trends today, you know, we think about natives, we think about green, we think about sustainability. And I don't want to steal Cliff Roof's thunder, but I think, you know, when you think about natives, we always think, well, they're better adapted because they grow here. They're pest resistant, they're carefree, they're non-invasive. Yes and no. And I think Dick Burr summed it up best when he said some native plants are good landscape plants in some location. It's all about site selection, because a lot of these native ornamentals may be growing in a forestry canopy where it's shaded, where it's moist, and we take that plant as a homeowner and plant it out in full sun in a dry location and expect it to thrive or survive. And sometimes that's not going to happen. I think the advantage that someone looking to propagate native plants from seed, there are many advantages. One would be superior cultivars or selections. You know, when we look at seed propagation, the genetic diversity is just immense. That's where a lot of these unusual Cercis cultivars, for example, have come from. A lot of our natives, you can go from the far western parts of the state to the eastern part of North Carolina to the coast. And some of these native ornamentals thrive in all of these different climatic zones. They're not as site sensitive as maybe some of our more selective type of ornamental plants that we brought in from other continents. Some of them transplant easy and some don't, and that's one of the reasons that they're not in the industry quite as readily. And then the thing about a lot of the native ornamentals, and I hear this from the field growers that I work with on a daily basis. I'll show you some pictures here in a moment of some liners and whips that have been brought in from the West Coast. And a lot of times when they buy some of these native ornamentals that are hard to find, that may be bare rooted or in a 1 to 3 gallon container from a small propagation nursery in North Carolina, their biggest complaint is the size of the liner or whip. And a lot of it's got to do with our growing conditions are as good as maybe some other areas of the country, but it's just that we're dealing with plants that have a moderate to minimal growth rate. They just aren't as fast a growing plant. And you can look at it from a different standpoint or from a positive standpoint, that maybe that makes that plant a little more expensive of a plant, where maybe you can get a higher price for it when you do have a larger plant like that. A lot of our native ornamentals have numerous seasons of interest. Probably one of my favorites, sourwood, which I think you can get 4 seasons of interest out of. You can look at the flowers, the bark, the fruit, the fall coloration, the winter interest, just the different characteristics that you could use for some of these plants. Some of them may be inexpensive, but some of them also, I was thinking when I was putting this together, you pretty much have to go to an upscale garden center to find a lot of these native ornamentals. I mean, think about it. If the last time you went to a box store or a mass merchandiser, did you see some of these native ornamentals that you could actually buy? Probably not. They're going to have the same generic 30 to 40 different cultivars or varieties of things that are commonly propagated in the industry. Some may be disease and insect-free, some may not, but here again, depends on how you treat the plant, how you put it in the site. And if you do get these plants established, they are proven to have a good life expectancy in the landscape. I throw this up here because Dick Burr, who's retired extension specialist with NC State University, wrote the book on growing and propagating showy native woody ornamentals. And I would highly encourage you, if you're serious about doing this, that you may want to get a copy of this. It's put out by the University of North Carolina Press. It's really not an expensive book, but Dick pretty much has put in here about seed propagation and propagation by cuttings of some of the more interesting showy and native woody ornamentals that I think have a place in our industry. When we think about native plants, and I throw this up here about the pass-along plants, I think that's the connotation that most of us have with native plants and propagating them. We take a cutting off of a plant out of the woods, or we collect seed off of some out of the woods, and we try to grow them. And we get 20 or 30 seedlings and we pass them along to our friends and neighbors. And I think that's the connotation that we have. We're basically propagating. For years, the University of North Carolina Botanical Garden at Chapel Hill has promoted conservation through propagation of natives. Basically, we need to be propagating them, we need to be growing them to landscape-sized material, we need to be putting them out to ensure their survivability. And basically, by doing this, we minimize the possibility of creating endangered native plants throughout North Carolina. I throw this up here because I feel like you need to have some idea of what's really involved. I think the purpose of this workshop today is to look at the seed propagation. But if you look at the schematic process of what's involved in growing a landscape-sized ornamental plant to get it to market, basically there are a number of different places that you could really find your niche. One would be seed propagation, cutting propagation, or tissue culture. But our goal, and really I think this is where you're going to be marketing your plant, is in the liner stage or at the whip stage. And basically with the liner stage, what we're trying to do is to take that plant, take a seed or a cutting and get some roots on it, and then grow it up to a size that a field grower or a container grower or pot grower can basically throw that into their system and turn it out in a very short time to basically end up with a finished tree to where it's ready to be sold at a garden center, sold to a landscaper, a rewholesaler, or installed in someone's landscape. I throw this up here because with seed propagation, there's so much diversity out there in nature versus vegetative propagation. And this just shows or depicts some of the things that we could do if we had a seed nursery. Basically, we could actually direct sow them, sow the germinates or transplant the emergents, and end up selling natives in a container situation. We could sell them as bare root transplants to field nurseries or to municipalities. But the great thing about the propagation characteristics is we have such a diversity of species in the southern Appalachian. We have that genetic variability that we're looking for. We have, well, we do have some time constraints, and I'm going to talk on that in a moment. But then we look at the cost per plant, because when you get to thinking about the amount of space that's needed to sow 1,000 seeds versus the space that would be needed to take 1,000 cuttings or 1,000 one-gallon plants, seed propagation, if you're just starting out and have very limited resources, very limited space, that would be ideally the way to go. If we look at native seed propagation, you know, you have to ask yourself, all right, am I going to go out and collect the seed, or am I going to buy the seed? But if you're going to do native seed propagation, you're going to have to do one or the other. If we look at seed propagation, it's fast, it's easy. Like I say, we can turn out quite a few plants in a very short time. One thing about native seed propagation is if we look at some of our woodland species, one thing that we can do is speed up the process by doing it ourselves, because some of these seeds may take several years to germinate in nature. We can do processes like stratification, scarification, maybe reduce the germination time, and make these unique seedlings available in a more timely manner, versus the only drawback to seed propagation compared to cutting propagation is some of these plants, it may be 2, 3, 4, 5 years before we have a plant that's actually, or a liner that's large enough to be sold to the next stage in the industry. I throw this in because the objective, whether it's cutting propagation or seed propagation, is to have a transplant or liner with a good root system that appears to be of top quality for these growers, because that's what they're looking for. Quality will always sell. And I think whatever system you're using, you know, your objective is to basically produce plants that are a decent size, and something like this maybe would go to the field. If I were a liner or whip producer, grow them for a year, get them larger, try to develop a straight trunk if it were a deciduous species, and then sell it to the next stage. I throw this in because budding and grafting, sometimes we often forget that, you know, a lot of what we're buying when we buy a budded or grafted plant is we're buying something that's very limited, very difficult to propagate, but all of these things are budded or grafted usually onto some type of native rootstock. So that would be another avenue that you could look at if you were looking at collecting seed and propagating some of these natives. A number of, I'll use for example, dogwoods. For years, dogwoods that were in the industry, most of them are budded, but they're all on the native rootstock. But maybe they were selected because they were pink blooming, they were red blooming, double blooming, very unique growth characteristic. So this would be another potential avenue for you to profit from seed propagation of some of the native ornamentals. And I throw this in because this is a propagation nursery in western North Carolina. This gentleman probably buds or grafts, I don't know, maybe 100 different species of plants. So you know, you're looking at a good diversity or demand for rootstock. Where is he getting his quality rootstock from? And then finally, micropropagation, that really ties in somewhat with seed propagation, but this is sort of I call it the biotech propagation that we're dealing with today. Just wanted to make you aware that this is another avenue. One of the challenges that I've seen with micropropagation, especially with some of our native ornamentals, is they're able to propagate them in tissue culture. They get roots on them, they get shoots on them. We take them to the field and they're duds. They just don't grow. And I think that's one of the things that tissue culture really they haven't worked out is, and I've seen this with a lot of these expensive new varieties, cultivars that they brought onto the market. They look promising. You put them in a production system, they just don't perform. There are a number of different ways that you could go. I put this up here is to get you to thinking about that, you know, we talk about seed propagation, we're not totally limiting ourselves to just little bitty cells. I mean, they can be in a variety of different type containers. They could be bare root, depending on your resources, the size of your operation. But once we get them out of that and we get them up germinated from seed, our next goal is to get them into a liner condition. We want to get a root system on them because this is what the growers want. I don't know how many times, and we learned about 10 years ago, when a lot of the plants were coming onto the market, a lot of the newer plants, a lot of the field growers were taking quart pots to the field. That lasted for about a year or two when you have 95% mortality. And a lot of it had to do with they just didn't have a root system on them. They had a top, but no roots. And so now they've gone to larger containers before they transplant them to the field. But usually when we talk about liners, we're talking about that first year of plant growth. It's usually that, if you look in the catalog, it's going to sometimes be mentioned as a 1.0 seedling. This is where a number of our shade and ornamental trees are sold as bare root liners. Basically, they're started from seed, cuttings, or tissue culture, and just about all types of plants in the nursery industry are propagated this way. Like I say, our objective is that branched root system so that when it goes to the field, I will tell you a lot of the times size, height-wise, really doesn't matter a lot to these growers or to a container grower, because I've seen them bring in 10-foot whips, and all of them are usually going to cut them back to 5.5 to 6 feet. And you know, if you tell a homeowner to do that, they're going to look at you like, well, I'm cutting 60% of the plant back and throwing that away. I'm not going to do that. And but yet,
I paid $30 for the stick.
right. Mm-hmm. But there are a number of liner producers out there in the U.S. Traditionally, the folks in Western North Carolina spend millions of dollars each year to Oregon and Middle Tennessee. In the catalogs, what you're going to see is it listed as a liner stage. The seedlings could be 1-0, 2-0, or 3-0s. Basically, that's in reference to the number of years that they've been in a seed bed. Then you may sometimes see like 1-1s or 3-2s, which means they've been in a seed bed for 3 years and then a line-out bed for 2 years. And with a lot of our Christmas tree seedlings, like Fraser fir, a lot of times those are 3-2 seedlings. And people don't realize that when they're taking a seedling this high, that that's a 5-year-old plant. So with some of these native ornamentals that you may be propagating from seed, you know, sometimes you have to ask yourself, why are they not more available in the trade? And a lot of it could be the amount of time that it's going to take to grow them up to a transplantable size. And a lot of folks aren't geared up because time is money. And that's one of the reasons they tend to grow a lot of these plants that are faster growing. But I would say that there's a niche market out there for folks that may want to grow some of these slower things and have time, especially some of the younger folks in the crowd. Okay. But with liner production, you can look, there are a number of different ways to do it. This is the old traditional way. Basically, we just made our beds and sowed the seeds. This is just reinforced concrete wire. Cover it with a little white copoly in the winter, let them germinate, grow them up, use them either for rootstock for budding or grafting, or take them to the field and grow them up to get a bigger root system on them and a straight stem. This nursery here, what they do is they buy in seeded and rooted cutting liners, usually from the West Coast. They grow them for 1 year to 2 years in a pot, and then they sell them to a field grower or to a garden center or to a municipality. Here, what they've done is basically brought in some of these seedlings that basically they came in a flat and have propagated them or moved them up into 3-gallon containers. There are a number of propagation nurseries out there. Lou's Lake Short Nursery, the reason I throw this in here, no, you don't have to have all of these greenhouses to get started. But you know, you are going to at some point have to decide which, are you just going to sell them out of the flats or containers, or are you going to transplant them to the field, grow them up to a larger size, and then hopefully get to this point to where this is where the money is. The larger the liner, usually the more pricier it is, and the more unique it is, the more pricier it's going to be. And you can't see this, but the reason I put this in here, what you'll see is we sell seedlings, but you get the quality for free. And that's what all growers want. Everyone in the green industry, it doesn't matter if they're retail, wholesale. And people always say, well, the market's saturated. Well, I will say, well, maybe you can't compete with folks out there on price, especially maybe some of the West Coast folks, or maybe the Middle Tennessee folks, or some of the folks in the Deep South. But you can compete on quality. And I will tell you, most of the folks I deal with in Western North Carolina would prefer to buy it locally if they can get it. I'm talking about liners. And there's a lot of small liner producers throughout the foothills that basically they don't market themselves. You would never know they were there, you know, turning out several 100,000 units a year that are going to these field growers in 1 gallons. They don't have to because they've established themselves with these larger growers. And as I say, they like to keep the money here in North Carolina versus sending millions of dollars to the West Coast. Liner Source, big nursery production out of Florida. I put this up here, experience and quality. This is what they're marketing. But what you'll see, quality, quality, quality. I put up here 4 companies, 2 of them in Georgia and 2 of them in Tennessee. And the point I want to make is there's a lot of growers out there. They offer a diverse selection of liners. A lot of them started from seed, some from cutting, some from grafting and budding, some from tissue culture. But Phytotector was one of my favorite for years. They're no longer in business. If you look at nurseries in North Carolina, for the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've always stayed right at 1,500 to 1,600 certified registered nurseries. People are always going out of business, and there's people stepping up the plate to come into business. And there have been people that have been extremely successful once they've established their niche. So I think the point is it profitable? Well, are you a risk taker? I think that's the question you have to ask yourself before you make the leap of faith. Like I say, a lot of our larger whips and liners come off the West Coast. I put this up here because as I was going through all the West Coast catalogs, it never fails. Just about all of them have quality on their catalog. And they know they're getting quality when they ship them to North Carolina or another nursery on the East Coast. Now, you can look at some of the programs that are out there. Maybe what you're going to do is specialize on growing redbud liners or dogwood liners for some of these specialty programs that maybe some of these larger growers have, where they're doing their budding for mainly red maples or Japanese maples, which really isn't a native here per se, but I use this as an example. Maybe it's a specialty dogwood type program where there's new cultivars constantly being introduced. A lot of them, like I say, are budded or grafted. The opportunity's there for someone like yourself to maybe tap into that market. No, you don't have to have an elaborate greenhouse structure to get started, but it can be very simple. This is actually a Propagation Nursery in Wilkes County. And this gentleman grew quite a few liners over his career. Most of them he would transplant to the field himself or sell to other folks. And what he did here initially, these were shade trees that basically got too large. So what he did is very creatively came in and just put up simple hoop houses, sowed his seed out, some black cloth for shade. And in a small area, you can really turn out a lot of transplants. I mean, it doesn't have to be a fancy greenhouse. On the other side of the coin, we look at clonal propagation, and over the years, for the last 10 years, the majority of people that call me, well, I want to start a propagation nursery. What do you want to grow? Leyland Cypress and arborvitae. Well, folks, if you drive around the fields right now, there's a lot of Leyland Cypress and arborvitae. There's a lot of these folks that have just one variety in their propagation nursery, and they're sitting on thousands and thousands of 1-gallon plants right now because there's no market for them. Diversity is the key if you're going to propagate native plants. And this is Gardens of the Blue Ridge. Been around for over 100 years. And this is something that you could do, is maybe look at not necessarily large numbers of any one species, but maybe small numbers of of diverse species to get to the market. Now this is a mail order nursery. They do sell retail, they do sell wholesale, or maybe just something very simple where you've got maybe 10 or 15 different species or cultivars of native plants, and you're moving them as a 1-gallon versus a quart pot. So, look at how you're going to package your product that you're going to be selling. Other examples, you could have just inexpensive benches, do a lot of propagation where basically you sow your seeds in possibly a nursery flat or community flat, and then transplant them up into individual cells and sell them this way. Or here again, going back to just the traditional way of sowing them in a bed and then just going in and lifting them and selling them in large quantities. What you could do if you already have an existing greenhouse is possibly come in and partition off a section and create a propagation section where basically you're just using that as your seed germination area. Whip production, with the liners, our objective is mainly to get roots on the plant. With whip production, we're trying to get height on the plant. And this is probably what most of the field growers buy in from Tennessee, also from the West Coast. I know for the last 20 years we've been telling people in North Carolina, you know, liner or whip production. And we've had a few people to venture out. Some have been successful, some haven't. But basically it's just mass production. And the thing that I want to point out, if you're going to do this, look at that consistency, look at that quality, straightness. You would be amazed at the number of field growers that I talk with that buy from some small growers here in North Carolina in 3-gallon containers, and there are 2 comments that are they aren't big enough and they're not consistent enough in their quality. But I think the growers sometimes are used to getting these 10-foot whips in off the West Coast, and they don't realize you're dealing with a native plant that may be the same age, and it's only going to be this high. They could put it on the West Coast. That's why they're not growing them on the West Coast, because they're used to people buying big stuff and turning it around in a year or 2. What this gentleman does in Morganton is he basically buys in like reedy cuttings or seedlings, puts them in the field and grows them for a year, and then turns around and sells these liners / whips to the field growers in the foothills. Marion, Lenore, like I say, it's doable in Wilkes County. It's doable in Alexander County. It's doable up on the mountain if you have the right environment. But the key is, and if you notice, these aren't like those big whips coming off the West Coast, but there's a market for them if you've got the time and the resources, if you wanted to go to the next stage and actually put them into the field and try to get some size on the plants. And if you're going to do this, really, it's not a lot of specialized equipment, maybe just a tractor and a U-blade for undercutting them to lift them, and maybe a cold storage area until you can get them to the growers in the spring of the year. Now, the other thing is, a lot of the growers in western North Carolina, we always thought that spring was the ideal time. If you go to a lot of the literature or to some of the textbooks, they're going to say, well, you know, to get it ready for them in the spring. These guys would rather have the plants to go in the ground in the fall of the year. And that's where the advantage is. If you're growing these native seedlings, you got them in containers, and they can get those containers in the fall of the year and get them in the ground in the fall. That's another plus that you would have. Because if they're bringing in bare root from Middle Tennessee or the West Coast, probably it's not going to be ready till the spring. And then finally, the ultimate goal was to get that finished tree. But here is where you all fit in if you're interested in looking at it from a profitability standpoint as far as seed propagation. Here again, you're probably not looking at this end of it, but hopefully, you know, this is what we consider a quality whip, 1 to 1.5 inch in caliber. What I wanted to point out here, this is about a 300-acre nursery, a lot of probably 150 different species and cultivars. If you look up here where they're in their holding yard where they brought their liners in, basically, see the diversity in the sizes? So with our natives, they're not going to be those tall, slender liners or whips. However, they may fall into this category. There's a place for them. And here again, it's educating the grower or the customer that you're dealing with. And I think, you know, the comments that I've had as far as negative comments, they have to realize this is something new and different. They never planted these before. It's a new species. There's a demand. Right now, if you look at our current market, 3 and 4 inch caliper run-of-the-mill standard plants are being cut down because there's no market. However, if you have these unique natives, different sizes, smaller sizes. That's what the landscapers want. That's what the garden centers want. So right now would be the ideal time to have them if you'd had this workshop 2 or 3 years ago, Ronald. But nobody knew what the economy was going to do. I throw this up here. Small nurseries, there's a lot of these scattered in western North Carolina. Yes, they're planting arborvitaes, but just imagine that truck filled up with 1 gallon or 3 gallon Sirewoods, Styrax, Franklinia that have come from your seed propagation nursery. A lot of times these guys, all they want is 200 or 300 of a particular species or cultivar. And so, pardon? 40 or 80. So, you know, think about that in your marketing plan. You know, you don't have to have 100,000 Leyland Cypress in 1 gallon containers when we're talking about propagating natives from seeds. Okay. Native deciduous azaleas. I know there's a couple folks in the room that have been very successful at this. I throw this up as an example because if you're looking at collecting your seed, I missed the earlier talk, but you know, a lot of times this may be done late spring, summer, early fall. And you know, there's this cleaning process that has to go through them, and there's the part of sowing them in the flats, the transplanting process, potting them up to a larger cell, getting them up to maybe a 24 cell, to a gallon or 3 gallon pot. With a lot of these natives, if you got them in containers, they're probably going to need some type of overwintering structure in it. Doesn't have to be a really expensive greenhouse. I have a simple overwintering structure that's made out of PVC pipe and plastic, and it does the purpose. It keeps them from freezing. But in some cases, you don't even need that. You could just use a thermal blanket to overwinter your native plants in your propagation nursery. But I sort of wanted to give you a general background because I didn't know how many of you all were growers, if, you know, basically the process that's involved, how you could possibly fit yourself into this production process, at what stage. So I think everyone in here aspires to be a nurseryman, right? Okay. Just want to marry one, okay. So Tony Avett in his book, Definition of a Nursery, for those of you who may not be aware of this, a place where young trees or other plants are raised for experimental purposes, for transplanting, or for sale. Or B, a black hole that absorbs the lives of those looking to start a. Okay, I'm going to let you make that decision from a profitability standpoint because really, you know, that's what it's all about. 9 out of 10 folks that come to visit me that want to start a nursery, I discourage from starting a nursery because they don't have what it takes. And a lot of them are in that B category. It's just going to be a black hole that absorbs everything that they do in A. But to be successful, the workshop today, basically you're going to get a lot of information about the production aspect. But to be successful and profitable, you've got to have a good marketing plan and a good business plan. And I always tell folks that business plan, if you're not learning it from a 2-year program, most community colleges in the area have a small business center. They'll help you with that business plan. But you'd be amazed the number of folks who grow the plants and then they want to know, what do I do with them? And usually that is a definite road for failure. But so what should you grow? Dave, I'm sure you've heard basically grow what sells, right? That's easy, it's a cliche, and sometimes it may be inadequate. Depends on where your market is. Well, I put this up here because think about what you're hearing on the news today, green and sustainability. And I think this company does a very good job at marketing. Environmental Nursery, green since 1996. We sell drought and heat tolerance plants. We sell ornamental and native grasses, native perennials and ferns, wetland and environmental restoration plants, bioengineering materials, storm and wastewater management, golf course enhancement. The marketing. How are you going to move these natives? Where are they going to go? There's a lot of opportunities out there, but you're going to have to develop that yourself. So what should you sell? Well, the question is, are you going to be in business if you have this much product shrinkage? And this is that same nursery that had all of those Leyland Cypress and arborvitaes. Well, they sold a few, but they've still got quite a few there that's going to be thrown down the bank. That's your profit. And basically, this is one of those things where you have to get out, you have to talk to customers, you have to talk to nurserymen. What can I grow for you? What would you buy if I could offer this to you as a 3-gallon plant at your garden center? There are a number of conservation groups out there, a lot of these wetland groups, Department of Transportation, the park system. I mean, sometimes some of these areas, they don't have to be #1 plants. Maybe they can be a lower quality. That's another avenue. But it's going to evolve, and if you try to grow the same thing that you're growing today, 20 years from now, you probably will still be selling some of them, but the question is, will you still be in business and making money? And probably the best thing to do is read your trade magazines, attend some of the nursery workshops, talk with these folks over here at the community college. They've got the big crystal ball right up on the building here. It tells you what you should grow to be profitable. Join the International Plant Propagator Society. Talk with the growers. You have to decide, what are you going to do? You're going to grow seedlings, you're going to grow transplants, you're going to grow liners, you're going to grow whips. Or maybe, I don't want to do seeds, I'm just going to do rooted cuttings. I know, that's not the purpose of the workshop, but that may be an option. This is just a market channel of where you potentially could sell some of those. I'm going to skip over that for sake of time. But crop selection. And the question is, can you grow what someone else is growing? Everyone should raise your hand and say yes. Remember, quality. Is there a shortage on the market or potential shortage in the future? Now that's probably the hardest question to answer. You'd be amazed at the number of folks that telephone me and want to know, well, I'm going to start in a nursery business and I want to know what to grow, Dave. Give me your top 10. Well, we all know that if I tell you my top 10 today, then in 3 to 5 years, they may be the bottom 10. And it's just a trial and error, and you really have to do your homework. You have to read a lot. Do you have a competitive advantage? I think, yes, we do have a competitive advantage. I told you earlier, the folks here will buy from you if you can offer the product. Who's the competition? Oregon, Middle Tennessee, Deep South nurseries. And there's some here in North Carolina that are doing a fantastic job. What is the future demand? Well, we have a president who's talking about green and sustainability. All right, people probably are going to think natives are the cure-all. And that, going back to that myth about native plants, and Cliff Root's going to be talking about me about using natives for landscaping, and he's going to offer his 10 cents. Here again, what can you offer? Can you offer this? This will get your foot in the door. I throw this up here, Carlton Plants. 10 years ago, didn't really know that much about them. They are a big nursery liner producer on the West Coast. But I've seen them, and they've really diversified quality and value in 1,000 details. It's all about marketing, folks. Can you sell that? And then what are our assets to make it profitable? Well, proximity to market. We're right here. We're within a night's drive of over half of the country's population on the East Coast. You're located in western North Carolina, and some of these folks in eastern Tennessee and possibly eastern North Carolina would buy from you if you could offer them a quality product. We've got the ideal climate. We're going to the woods, we're collecting something that grows here naturally, and if we put it in a similar site, and hopefully we can adapt that site to the plants that we're growing. That's really the challenge sometimes. Uniqueness, perceived quality. What can we offer them in a different size or a species? Can you grow the crop profitably? And I've already addressed that. Well, that's one of those things where you're going to have to sit down and crunch the numbers. What type of resources do you have available? How much time do you have to divert from maybe your normal job or from your studies to hopefully make that profit? I think the bottom line is, can you offer that complete package? If you're going to grow native seeds or native plants from seed, delivery, customer service, uncompromised quality, unique marketing. This is what you've got to do to get your foot in the door to make it profitable. And how do you start? Well, probably the best thing is to attend some trade shows, pick up price list, find out what people are growing. Get price lists for the field growers, the end product, see what they're selling. You can just about sit down and push the pencil and come up with a list of 15 to 20 different plants or species that maybe you could start with. And then it's making contact, it's visiting nurseries, trying to build that rapport. I will tell you, in this industry, if you're going to be successful, the key is offering quality and developing customer service rapport. You go sit for half a day on the tailgate of a pickup truck with some of these growers, they'll buy everything that you got once you win their friendship. And that's possibly the way you get your foot in the door. There's some good U.S. government publications out there. These used to be free. I think you have to buy them now, but if you're looking at seedling propagation, I would encourage you to possibly get these three, the nursery planting, the seedling propagation, and the containers and growing media or substrate. I think sort of in a nutshell, there's opportunities for you all in the room if you would want to look at growing natives. I think one of the biggest deterrents right now is availability. I think there's an untapped market for the homeowner, because if you do go to try to find some of these native ornamentals, basically you have to go to a very specialized garden center. And while some of the field growers are growing them right now, a lot of times most of these trees are shipped to the Northeast, Midwest, or somewhere else. They're really not made available locally. And so maybe that's one of the avenues we want to look at, is to grow them up into 3 gallons, 5 gallons, 7 gallons, and maybe sell them at a farmer's market or start your own retail nursery.